Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. It's time for another book review. Now, it's been a little while since I've done a video. I've been pretty busy recently. I'm actually in the process of moving house, so I haven't had a lot of time to do many videos, but I've still been reading, and I really wanted to talk about what I've just read, because it's pretty interesting. It's this book, Bats Out of Hell, by Guyan Smith, published in 1978. Now, lately, I was in the mood to read something vintage, something pulpy, so I chose this. A major draw being that this novel is actually set in my hometown of Birmingham, England. So I gave this a go. It's my first time to read this author, and he was actually quite a prolific horror writer back in the day. So it's a little bit of a change in genre focus for this channel, as he was never really thought of as a science fiction writer. But that said, you could definitely say that this particular book falls within the category of sci-fi horror. It's a viral outbreak story about a horrific new disease, a bat-borne disease that emerges from a research centre leak, and the terrifying consequences that follow as it spreads across society. So, how does that happen? Well, at the start of the book, we get introduced to a scientist at this lab, and his name is Brian Newman. He's doing some research into meningitis using bats and rodents in his lab in the West Midlands, just outside Birmingham. Somehow, he manages to create a mutated strain of viral meningitis in his bats that is making them go insane. It disrupts their echolocation. It causes them to act aggressively and fly about maniacally inside their glass cage. Eventually, they succumb to the disease in an agonizing death. So that's what we get introduced to right at the start of the story. There's very little backstory or scientific explanation for this. We just jump straight into this scenario. And what's more, the professor realizes that this disease and these bats are very dangerous because it's communicable to humans. So human contact with these bats must be avoided at all costs. All he really needs to do is just wait for the bats to die out in their cage so the experiment can be abandoned and the threat neutralized. But of course that doesn't happen. The bats manage to escape, and for a totally ridiculous reason. One evening, the scientist is having a row in his laboratory with his girlfriend, who's also his lab assistant, after she catches him two-timing with another woman. So yeah, he's not a very honourable character. In fact, he's a bit of a jerk. So they're having an argument. They have this big kerfuffle, and he gets a bit aggressive towards her. That enrages her, and she lashes out at him, inadvertently causing him to fall onto the bat cage, breaking the glass, and the bats escape instantly. And they rush out through the lab window, which is open, of course. And so out they go into the world outside, and thus begins the epidemic. It's quite a contrived scenario, but that's how the epidemic starts. And then throughout the rest of the narrative, we follow the devastating consequences of this episode as the bats spread across the Midlands and start attacking people and infecting them with this disease. And at first, it's mostly in sort of rural locations, villages, before they start heading towards the big urban centre, which is Birmingham. And so this story is told through a series of vignettes, and we get introduced to an array of different characters who come into contact with these bats. And these are quite interesting. Sometimes they are quite sort of stereotypical, and sometimes they're quite amusing. So they range from, for example, you've got the headmaster of a boys' school who has an intense fear of bats. There's another character who is a rabble-rousing, right-wing populist politician. And these episodes, they kind of function like horror short stories. So it's almost like a fix-up novel in a sense. And typically we don't have time to care for these characters because they only appear once and they don't show up again throughout the story. And you can probably guess why. Once a human is infected with the virus, there is a 100% mortality rate. All it takes is brief physical contact with a bat for the virus to spread. And the symptoms, they start off relatively mild, kind of like flu, but they very quickly deteriorate until the victim ends up in a state of utter agony, followed by paralysis, madness, and death. And honestly, this is a truly horrific disease. But what is perhaps scarier still is the anarchy and breakdown of order that rapidly ensues as the epidemic escalates and the government desperately tries to control the situation. The lab bats start making contact with other bats in the wild. They start breeding, and before long, there's a whole plague of these bats causing havoc across the whole region. And like I said, they start off in rural areas before descending on Birmingham. And this is a major city, right? In fact, it's the UK's second biggest city. So once the virus hits here, we start entering apocalyptic territory. The Prime Minister declares a state of emergency, and the government designates the whole of the Midlands as a quarantine zone. Citizens are ordered to stay indoors, and a military order is drafted to ensure no one can leave the region. But that doesn't stop people trying. People are desperate to escape. They're terrified of the bats, and things get worse and worse as the government is unable to help people. They're unable to provide adequate food and medicine for citizens stuck within the quarantine. So there's anarchy and rioting on the streets. It's absolute chaos. Birmingham has become a hellhole and a symbol for the imminent collapse of civilization. So I think this combination of elements works really well as a horror tale. You've got this horrific new disease, and you've got the social effects of the plague, which result in even more violence, death, and mayhem than just the disease by itself. And of course, you've got the bats. And let's face it, bats are creepy enough animals in normal times. But these aren't normal bats. They're rabid killer bats. So, as a horror concept, I think it works pretty well. It's as bleak as hell, and the violence and gore can be a bit gratuitous at times, but I must say I was pretty compelled when reading this. I really wanted to see where it was going, and I was really curious to see whether there was going to be any kind of positive or hopeful resolution in the end. Because alongside these vignettes, we also follow Brian Newman and his colleagues back at the lab while they try and work on creating an antidote, or at least trying to find some solution to the problem. So I was pretty gripped, not because this is well written or thought-provoking or emotionally impactful, which it isn't. There aren't really any characters that are worth caring about or ideas that will blow your mind. So this book doesn't contain any of those things, but it is very entertaining. It's intriguing in a morbid sort of way. And of course, there are some inevitable parallels with the COVID-19 pandemic of recent years. So that makes it all the more intriguing. Don't expect great literature, but if you're a fan of pulp horror or sci-fi horror or pandemic fiction, I think it's definitely worth a read. So I give Bats Out of Hell 3.5 stars. Let me know if you've read anything by this author, Guyan Smith, because I'm curious to see more of his work. I have another of his 70s horror classics, Night of the Crabs, which I picked up recently. So that could be interesting. Perhaps that will satisfy my next pulp horror fix. But in the meantime, I've just started reading Vigilance by Alan Stroud, which is the third book in the Fractal series. So I'll let you know my thoughts on this book soon. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.